Romans chapter 13 tonight. While you're turning there, getting ready for the reading of the Word tonight, don't forget that Sunday we have our Thanksgiving meal, and that's immediately after our morning service, and we trust that you'll be with us, and we'll have a great day. I want you to look with me beginning with verse 1. We're going to read the first 4 verses tonight. And the Word says, "Everyone must submit to governing authorities, for all authority comes from God, and those in positions of authority have been placed there by God. So anyone who rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and they will be punished. For the authorities do not strike fear in people who are doing right, but in those who are doing wrong. Would you like to live without fear of the authorities? Do what's right, and they will honor you. The authorities are God's servants sent for your good. But if you're doing wrong, of course, you should be afraid, for they have the power to punish you. They are God's servants sent for the very purpose of punishing those who do what's wrong." Tonight I'd like for us we're continuing a thought, and that is how we're going to survive and how we experience survival at this time. But the title of this lesson, of course, is Doing What's Right. Subtitle is The Path to Survival. Doing what's right, which is the path to survival. This word says that everybody has got to submit to governing authorities. There are no two ways around it. We can't live the way we want to live, even though that is human nature. Human nature is to live without any boundaries, to live without any jurisdiction that we have to adhere to. However, the Lord has instituted this for humanity's sake and for humanity's good. But we're not talking about the whole scope. We know that's the letter of the law, but we're talking about it in reference to the child of God here. And how we can survive, and our survival depends on our being willing to adhere even to the civil law. And so there's an issue currently going on in the state of Pennsylvania. I think it's about run its course. But you know what I'm talking about. There's 4 counties that have refused to adhere to the voting regulations that involve the counting of ballots that are considered not valid. They want to let the non-valid votes be included in a recount for this Senate position between the 2 parties, the Democrats and the Republican Party. Well, the courts have already established the rule of law, and it's already said it. And thankfully, just I know last night and yesterday, even the governor of the state, he did make a statement which kind of knocks all this in the head. And so, but it's just a blatant refusal to adhere to the law. That you can't look at it any other way. They've just said, I don't care what the law says, because we want to do something and we want to make it known, because laws are broken all the time. Well, that doesn't make it right. But it is a blatant refusal to adhere to the laws of the land, and it's a breach of the United States Constitution. And why are they doing it? All for the sake of surviving an election, which means a Senate seat for the Democratic Party in the grand scheme of things. Now, I want you to note that the election's already been called. We know it's a very, 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 very slim margin. I think it was like 48.6% of the vote went for the Democratic person and 48.8%. I mean, that is a slim, slim margin. But they did it. They they were going against the grain and saying, we don't care what the law says. We want to do this, and we want to count these ballots that are invalid. And even though it's already been called in favor of the Republican candidate, but they're head bent, and they are determined to not only break the law, but do so at the expense of taxpayer money to the tune of some $1 million. And that really is digging into the pockets of those people in the state of Pennsylvania. And so, but those elected officials, those commissioners in those counties, they've basically said, we don't care. We don't care how much it costs you. This is what we want to do so that we can survive in this power struggle. Because that's basically what it is. This is the exact opposite of doing what's right. It is the epitome. It is the pure definition of doing what is absolutely wrong. It's blatantly doing what's wrong. And this will lead to one's eventual demise. Let me say it again. Doing wrong will eventually lead to one's demise. It may not happen overnight. It may not happen right now. But I guarantee you, if it's allowed to continue on, and wrong is continued on, it will eventually lead to the demise of that person or that group of people that are guilty of continuing to do wrong. However, the flip side of that is this: doing what's right will lead to one's survival. It will lead to us surviving. And so God has established, He's established three institutions that we can see from Scripture. And the first institution that He established was the home. And you go back to Genesis chapter 2 and verses 18 through 25. We're not going to take time to read all of those. You can do that on your own time. But let me just tell you basically what it's saying there. It says that Adam was all alone and he needed somebody to help him. Now we knew that at that time he had animals, because it said the Lord allowed the animals to come to him and he was naming the animals. But this was not enough. He needed somebody to come alongside him. God saw this, and so He takes from him a part of, his body on his side. We commonly say that He took his rib, and from that one bone, that element of his side, He formed the woman. And He did this, why? So that Adam would have a companion, somebody that would be with him. And so He took it from his side because she was to be beside him, not trail behind him, but be beside him and work in conjunction with the one that God had given her, and that was Adam. Now, that doesn't mean that Adam is to lord himself over Eve. It doesn't mean that Eve is to lord herself over Adam. But together they walk, together in unity, and that's the way God has established it. Although God did give man the responsibility to oversee and to care and to take care of his mate, and that being Eve. And so we see the home was established immediately in chapter 2, because it is now husband and wife, Adam and Eve. And so this was the first institution that God established. But you get into chapter 9 of the book of Genesis, and you see the second institution. That's the institution of government. You say, well, I never realized that from chapter 9 of the book of Genesis, but if you look specifically in verses 5 and 6, and there again, we're not reading that tonight, but this is your homework. Take it with you. Read it later. But specifically in verses 5 and 6, it gives us regulations against lawlessness or murder. It basically says you can't murder somebody and get away with it. And so this is a form of government and is instituting what can be and cannot be done in the public arena. And so we see that in the early days of the establishment in this book of Genesis. But then the third institution that we see here that God has given us is the institution of the church. And in Acts chapter 2, specifically verses 42 through 47, we see the church or the body of believers. All of chapter 2 is about coming together. But specifically in those verses 42 through 47, we see the formation of a community of believers that was to work together, come together. In a sense, if you want to take it back to Genesis chapter 2, where Eve was brought into the world to come alongside of Adam, God intended for the body of believers to be a community, and a community is supposed to come alongside each other and to work together in unity. There's nothing that God established that is to work out of any particular disorder, but everything in unity and order. And so the same goes for the body of believers in the world, out in the world today. We have governing authorities, we have laws that regulate us as citizens of our country, and it is it's especially important for us as the body of believers to adhere to those things that are laws of the land. And so he talks about this in these few verses that we're looking at tonight. But in this letter particularly, in Romans, here's what Paul is writing. He's writing to the believers, not outside of the believers' realm, but he's writing to believers, and these believers were at the very heart of the Roman Empire. They were right in the thick of everything that was going on within the Roman Empire. And at that particular time, they were not really experiencing any fierce persecution as such. But that didn't mean it wasn't on the way, because it was a short time later that they experienced fierce persecution. But at that particular time and that point in history, Christianity was still considered a Jewish sect. And the Jewish religion, of course, it was approved by the Roman authorities. And so, by virtue of that, they weren't under extreme persecution at this given point, but it would come. Persecution for the body of believers would come, and it would come in a fierce manner. However, today, the day that would come when it would become very difficult for, if not impossible, for the Christian to stand firm and show loyalty to the government or Caesar, and it would be very difficult, and I'll say it this way, for them to offer sacrifices to the Lord and then at the same time say hail to Caesar. They just couldn't do it. And so at this time they didn't have basically a difficult time, but it would come where they were going to have to either stand and pay for their their loyalty to Christ or their disloyalty to Caesar. And so what Paul refutes here is, he says, we don't want to disavow who we are as a child of God. But at the same time, and we don't compromise our faith, we don't do anything of that nature. But what he does say is, but at the same time, we still owe allegiance to obeying the authorities and the government that is before us. And there's a reason why, several reasons why. Tonight I just want to look at one of them. And the reason why is for wrath's sake. In other words, there's justice to pay for wrongdoing. And I've got here on this slide, upholding the law by punishing those who do what's wrong. The law is going to be upheld. For those who do wrong, they've got to pay for the injustices. But we're saying the reason that we've got to be subject to the laws of the state is for wrath's sake, because there's justice, basically, that's going to be paid for wrongdoing. I want to look one more time at our text, if you will. It says, notice, everyone must submit to governing authorities. Everyone. And then he qualifies that statement by saying, for all authority comes from where? It comes from God. And in those positions of authority, he says, have been placed there by God. You might say, well, wait a minute, Pastor Andy, didn't I vote for so-and-so and so-and-so? Yeah, we do, and it is critical that we do voice our opinions and how we want the directions of things to go governmentally. And at the same time, we've got to understand this principle that God is the one. We don't appoint anybody, even though we vote, but God is the final authority, and He is the one who allows individuals to be in positions of authority. They've been placed there by God. He says, so anyone who rebels against authority is then rebelling against what God has instituted, and they'll be punished. So when we look at it from this perspective, we've got to understand what is happening here. If we rebel against the authority that God has established, then we're in essence going against the principles of what God has established for us. Verse 3, for the authorities do not strike fear in people who are doing right, but in those who are doing wrong. And then he asks this question, would you like to live without fear of the authorities? He says, if so, do what's right, and they'll honor you. It's amazing. And you've seen this numerous times, I'm sure. We'll be traveling along the interstate, and you'll be going within the realm that keeps you in safe going without getting a ticket. And generally there is a little bit of leeway. There's that they will allow you. Now here's a lawman here. He says 5. He's been in the law. I've always heard that it was about 7 in that realm. If you get over 7, you might get pulled over. Yes. And so what happens is I've seen people that were not even breaking the speed limit. They were going the speed limit, but when they saw somebody, blue lights or those lights that were going on the side of the road that had somebody pulled over, they would slow down. Almost to where they were very dangerous on the interstate. Because you're not supposed to go slower than 45. But it is hilarious to me. They're not breaking the law, but by nature, they ease off the gas or they get out of cruise control. And they go way below. And I've always thought it was funny to see people do that. It's a knee-jerk reaction. Why? Undoubtedly because maybe they were afraid that they were going to get penalized for just doing the speed limit. But that's not the case here. And that's what Paul says. He says, if you do what's right, and if you're within that ramification of safety as far as speed limit is concerned, without being in danger of getting a ticket, if you're doing that, they'll honor you. They'll say, go on ahead. I don't want you. I want the one who is exceeding the grace period or the grace area for it. And so he says, here, Paul says, for the authorities don't strike fear in people who are doing right. It's interesting, but in those who are doing wrong. And then he says, would you like to live without fear of the authorities? He says, well, if that's the case, just do what's right. If we do what's right, it is the path to our spiritual survival. He'll honor you, he says. They will honor you. And then he says in verse 4, the authorities of God, of God's servants, are sent for your good, But if you are doing wrong, of course you should be afraid, for they have the power to punish you. They've been given the jurisdiction to do that. And so they have the power to punish you. And then he says, they are God's servants sent for the very purpose of punishing those to do what is wrong. And I say thank the Lord for that. Thank the Lord that they do have that authority to punish wrongdoing. Just recently, they've concluded in the trial of this individual who murdered this young girl from Georgia, I guess it was. And they've convicted him, and he's convicted for life. Well, thank the Lord. Thank the Lord he's going to have to pay that penalty, and I'm surprised he didn't get the death penalty. But right now it's just a sentence for life, and hopefully it's with no chance of being paroled. And that's good. And that is a protection for those who are doing right. Therefore, we shouldn't be against the civil authorities in this role for doing what's right. Therefore, if we do what's right, they're going to honor us, and we don't have to worry about it, but we can applaud them for doing what is right to allow safety in the land. So the underlying principle here is that, and it can't be overlooked and it can't be understated, is simply this. It's God who has established the governments of the world. He has established the governments of the world. He has established right and wrong. And within those parameters, we are to adhere to that. It's a way that we're going to survive. This is just a very practical Bible study tonight of who we are in this world. But even as Christians, we still have to adhere to not only spiritual laws, but the laws of the land. Acts chapter 17. Look there with me in verses 24 through 28. It says, He is the God who made the world and everything in it. There again, He's established everything that's in the world. He says, since He is Lord of heaven and earth, He doesn't live in man-made temples, and human hands can't serve His needs, for He has no needs. He Himself, speaking of God, gives life and breath to everything, and He satisfies every need. From one man, He created all the nations throughout the whole earth, and He decided beforehand when they should rise and fall, and He determined their boundaries. So there again, God is the establishment of nations, His governments, rulers. He's the one who has determined this. Verse 27 says, His purpose was for the nations to seek after God and perhaps feel their way toward Him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. So that was his purpose. He establishes principles for us to abide by, but the bottom line is that we look to him for the final say. And so verse 28, it says, "For in him we live and move and exist. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring." Now, understanding the principles that have been established by God and the entities that have been established by God, this doesn't mean that he's responsible for the sins of tyrants. Because there are some rogue people that occasionally have been in government positions. The Roman Empire experienced tyrants. There were periods of times, even in the Roman government, that they had well-meaning people that were in authority and actually were very law-abiding. However, there came a time when there were tyrants that were in charge, and we saw what history has told us concerning that. But God wasn't responsible for the sin of any tyrant, and he's never been. But only that the authority to rule comes originally from God. So what we need to do is understand that authority has been established by God. He doesn't wink at these things. It's humanity that has failed to operate looking towards God as the final authority. And so we're looking to God as our final authority, but understanding that God is the authority. Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel had a problem with that. And he had to experience a very, very hard lesson. In fact, Daniel chapter 4 tells us about it, and I apologize to you, but I'm going to give you about 33 verses in this chapter because I believe it really shows us how we need to give all credence to God, for he is the final authority, but he has established different rules and people for authority here on earth. But notice this. Nebuchadnezzar, in chapter 4, sent this message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. And this is key because he was trying to tell them where he went wrong. Now notice what it says. He says, "Peace and prosperity to you. I want you all to know about the miraculous signs and wonders the Most High God has performed for me." He never could have been in this position had he not gone through what he had gone through in this horrible time. He says, verse 3 again, "How great are his signs, his powerful wonders, his kingdom will last forever, his rule throughout all generations." And then he says, "I, Nebuchadnezzar, was living in my palace in comfort and prosperity. But one night I had a dream that frightened me. I saw visions that terrified me as I lay in my bed. So I issued an order calling in all the wise men of Babylon so they could tell me what my dream meant. When all the magicians, enchanters, and astrologers and fortune tellers came in, I told them the dream. They couldn't tell me what it meant. He says, at last, Daniel came in before me, and I told him the dream. He was named Belteshazzar, after my God, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him." He didn't know any other way to say it. He understood that there were a plethora of gods, but there's only one God. But this is the way he explained it. And he said there's something different about Daniel. He is subject not only to me as king, but he's subject to one that is greater than he and me. And that's God. He says in verse 9, I said to him, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and that no mystery is too great for you to solve. Now, tell me what my dream means. And while I was lying in my bed, this is what I dreamed. I saw a large tree in the middle of the earth. The tree grew very tall and strong, reaching high into the heavens for all the world to see. It had fresh green leaves, and it was loaded with fruit for all to eat. Wild animals lived in its shade, and birds nested in its branches. All the world was fed from this tree. Then as I lay there dreaming, I saw a messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven. And the messenger shouted, "Cut down the tree and lop off its branches. Shake off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Chase the wild animals from its shade and the birds from its branches. But leave the stump and the roots in the ground, bound with a band of iron and bronze and surrounded by tender grass. Now let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the wild animals among the plants of the field. For 7 periods of time, let him have the mind of a wild animal instead of the mind of a human." Verse 17 is critical. Notice what it says, "For this has been decreed by the messengers. It is commanded by the holy ones, so that everyone may know that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world." Now he knew it at this point, but he is explaining to them how he got there. It says, he gives them to anyone he chooses, even to the lowliest of the people. Verse 18 says, "Belteshazzar, that was my dream. The dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, tell me what it means. For none of the wise men of my kingdom can do so. But you can tell me because the Spirit of the holy gods is in you." Well, we know why the others couldn't do it, because they had no relationship with the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And so Daniel, in verse 19, he begins to explain to him. He says, "Upon this hearing, Daniel, also known as Belteshazzar, was overcome for a time, frightened actually by the meaning of the dream. And then the king said to him, 'Don't be alarmed by the dream and what it means.' And so he replied, 'I wish the events foreshadowed in this dream would happen to your enemies, my lord, and not to you. The tree you saw was growing very tall and strong, reaching high into the heavens for all the world to see. It had fresh green leaves and was loaded with fruit for all to eat. Wild animals lived in its shade. Birds nested in its branches. That tree, your majesty, is you. For you have grown strong and great. Your greatness reaches up to heaven, and your rule to the ends of the earth. Then you saw a messenger, you saw a holy one coming down from heaven, and these were the words. It said, 'Cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump and the roots in the ground, bound with a band of iron and bronze and surrounded by tender grass.' He says, 'Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the animals of the field for 7 periods of time.' This is what the dream means, your majesty, and what the Most High has declared will happen to my Lord the King." In verse 25 is another key verse like verse 17. It says, "You will be driven from human society, and you will live in the fields with the wild animals. You will eat grass like a cow, and you will be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 periods of time will pass while you live this way, until you learn that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world and gives them to anyone he chooses." Hard lesson for him to learn, but this is what he had to learn. And again, I say, he said, until you learn, until you learn, until you learn. It's amazing how many times individuals have to learn certain lessons. Over and over again. But he says, until you learn that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world and gives them to anyone he chooses. Verse 26, "But the stump and the root," what do they represent? They were left in the ground, he says, and this means that you will receive your kingdom back again when you have learned that heaven rules. I can't begin to imagine what Nebuchadnezzar must have been thinking at this moment in his life. He's had this dream, and now he knows Daniel's a straight shooter. And Daniel is, with fear and trembling, he's telling him what God has revealed to him about what this dream means. And now Nebuchadnezzar has a big old knot in his throat. And he's thinking, oh my. It's going to be good after this season, but I've got to endure this. Because that's what Daniel said. He says, you're coming back. You're going to have a comeback. But it's going to be after you have learned that heaven rules and not you. Heaven rules. Verse 27 says, King Nebuchadnezzar, please accept my advice. And I love this part. He says, stop sinning and do what's right. This is probably the most important advice that Nebuchadnezzar could have ever heard in his life. And here's what Daniel says. He says, stop sinning and do what's right. He says, break from your wicked past and be merciful to the poor. Perhaps then you will continue to prosper. In other words, he said, you don't have to do this if you'll do what's right, if you'll heed the word of the Lord. But in verse 28 it says, but all these things did happen to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later. It was 12 months before. It was a whole year before he ever would experience the fulfillment of this dream. God gave him a grace period, didn't he? He gave him a chance. 12 months later, he was taking a walk on the flat roof of the royal palace in Babylon. Notice what he said in verse 30. As he looked out across the city, he said, look at this great city of Babylon. By my own mighty power, I have built this beautiful city as my royal residence to display my majestic splendor. He says, I am my own God. I've done it all. I don't have to listen to anybody else. I can live by my own set of rules. Verse 31 says, while these words were still in his mouth, a voice called down from heaven. Ooh, I bet he recognized that voice immediately. It hit him like a ton of bricks, literally, in that moment. Wouldn't you love to have seen his ashen face in that second? And this voice called down from heaven and said, O King Nebuchadnezzar, this message is for you. Listen and listen good. You are no longer ruler of this kingdom. Bam! And like that. I can imagine it was dead silence, just like it is right now. Verse 32 says, you will be driven from human society. You will live in the fields with the wild animals. You will eat grass like a cow. 7 periods of time will pass while you live this way until you learn that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world, and gives them to anyone he chooses. And the first part of verse 33 says, that same hour the judgment was fulfilled. To resist the law is to resist God. It was God who has established governments, nations, and allows leaders to be in positions. But it's up to us to adhere to the laws of the land. It's up to us to adhere to the godly principles, the authority of God. Because if we don't, there will be punishment to pay. Rulers and those that are in authority have the power to inflict punishment on humanity now. They can even decide whether or not they can take a life because of something that has been done, a heinous act with the death penalty. So again, it's God who has established human government. Why? Why? Because man is a sinner. And by his innate nature, he needs some kind of authority. We need some kind of authority over every one of us. So, therefore, because of this, those in authority over us, they've been given the right to see that justice is upheld. And again, I'm thankful for that. Because can you imagine the chaos? I mean, we see chaos in our world right now. I mean, you saw it just recently with these counties in Pennsylvania. We know it's wrong, but we're going to do it anyway because, I mean, people break the law all the time. And they just blatantly aren't afraid of the law. But thankfully, God has given us authority to make sure that justice is upheld. Now, you and I may not always, we might not always respect the persons that are in positions of authority. That's possible. But we have to respect the position. I'll say this, and I know we're getting close to our time, and we're almost through for tonight. When we, years ago, we pastored down in South Louisiana, and you've heard me say it was just predominantly Catholic down there. That was the strong, Catholicism was very strong. In our little community of 2,000 people, we were the only Assembly of God church. We had one Baptist church. We had one Catholic church. And guess who ruled the roost? It was the Catholic Church. The Catholic priest. His name, everybody knew him as Father Mac. Father Mac was an alcoholic. I mean, he could drink anybody under the table. He was an alcoholic and didn't hide it. Huge festivals in South Louisiana. They have a festival for everything. Our community was known as the Catfish Festival of the world. And the Catholic Church would be the location for this huge festival. And it would be all kinds of drinking and reveling and everything else right there on the premises. And so he was a man of the cloth. He was well respected in our community by most people because most of them were Catholic. They didn't really respect his being an alcoholic, but they did respect his office of being the priest. It was never more real to me as I understood, and I'd never experienced this before. When I moved there, I had friends that were pastoring in other neighboring towns, and we were friends, Assembly of God people. I had a buddy that lived on the other side of the lake from where we lived. Now, other side of the lake, you know, it was about a 30-mile ride around the lake, and so to get there. But he and I would, we joined a little country club just to play golf. And we struck up on it by accident. It was a sweet little place. It had tennis courts, it had a golf course, it had the pool. It had 2 restaurants. It was just a nice little country club. And went in there and found out that ministers were given a special rate. Now, the pro there, he told me, he says, hey, look, don't let any of these members know the deal you get, because they would be just outraged. And he says, all you have to do is you pay a $30 food charge for the month. That was it. All golf was free. All we had to do was just go in the restaurant and spend at least $30 a month on food. That was it. And so after church on Sundays, I get on the phone, call up my buddy. It was on the north end of the lake, say, hey, let's meet. And so it was about the same amount of distance for us, about 25 miles apart. We'd go to this little place. We'd eat lunch there at the restaurant and just have great family time and all like that. And I asked the pro one day, I said, can you tell me, how is it, why is it that you get such a break for us to have a membership here and it virtually costs us nothing? He said, it's because you're a clergy. He said, the clergy is highly respected in this part of the world. I could have lived any way I wanted, but because I had the office, I could go over to other golf courses, and I understood. All I had to do was say, I'm a minister, and show them my credentials, and they'd give me discounts. You said, why didn't you ever leave Louisiana? It was a God thing. But what I'm saying is that we may not always like the person that's in authority. We may not agree with them in principle, but they are in a position that's been established by God. God is the one who has formed these governments, these nations, and allows even Nebuchadnezzar. You remember, he said it. Because he said, hey, he's got the right and the authority to put in and remove whoever he wants at any given point of time. And so while we may not always like certain ones that are in authority, we have to give respect to the position of authority. I want to close tonight by reading one more time verses 3 and 4 of our text. Notice this. It says, for the authorities do not strike fear in people who are doing right, but in those who are doing wrong. Would you like to live without fear of the authorities? He says, do what's right, and they'll honor you. The authorities are God's servants sent for your good. But if you're doing wrong, of course, you should be afraid, for they have the power to punish you. They are God's servants sent for the very purpose of punishing those who do what is wrong. So again, Paul writes in verse 3, do what's right. Do what's right, and they'll honor you. In other words, if you're caught doing what's right, you don't have to live in fear. We're just caught doing what's right. We don't have to worry about it. We don't have to live in fear. So, I go back to the title of this Bible study, and that is, do what's right. It's the path to survival. Do what's right in our communities. Do what's right. Treat people fair. Do what's right with the law. We're not going to defund the police, are we? Because God's established them for our own good, for our benefit. And so we're going to just uphold the law, and we're going to do what's right, and the Lord's going to honor us, but people in our society are going to have to honor us because we're doing what's right. It's a biblical principle. It's a very practical principle, but it is one that is biblical, and with this, we're going to survive if we'll continue to do what the Word says. Lord, I love you. I thank you. Thank you for the lessons that we learn from your Word, but also the practical lessons we've learned in life. And we've seen it. We understand it. Now, Lord, I just pray that you'll help us to be propagators of these truths so that others will see the importance of abiding by the law. Spiritual law as well as the civil law. And we give you all the thanks and all the glory because you're our final authority. We declare it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen, and may the Lord bless you.